I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Iam Europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia.
Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Jag som europeanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem Europejczykiem.
Esu Europieter.
Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja grażdanka Europy.
Ja Romanianka Europa. Esu Europieter.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.
So here we go again with European Citizens Radio. I am Ulrike Geraud and I'm not sitting in Café Aroma, our preferred place, but at home because this time today I'm remote with Victor Breurs. Victor is Dutch. He's a good friend of mine since years. He has studied political science and then finances, has been working in the finance ministry, and now, like me, like many, is a little bit puzzled about Europe's future. And so he did a huge project from the Netherlands and he wants to interview people all across the European continent because he wants to write a European manifesto, put this in a book, put all the angles from all the different European people in that book. And in all the people he wanted to interview, I was part of them because I'm old friend with Victor. So we had an interview about what needs to change in Europe, what can stay, do we need a constitution, what is the European citizens, all these questions. By the way, you can find text work on all these questions on the European Democracy Lab because the European Democracy Lab is running the European Citizens Radio. Go to our website, click, give us some money if you like what we do, because we believe in the entity and the unity of the European continent. Back to Victor, as we share the same goal, he came to me, was interviewing me, so the interview we will hear now is a little bit in reverse order. Victor is questioning me, but kindly enough, he allowed us to put this also on European Citizens Radio, so here we go.
What I was interested about, we got to know each other, was it 5 or 6 years ago, just after the publication of your, I think, one of your greatest works. It's about creating, well, the European utopia, you call it, or the political utopia at least. And it's about creating a European demos. What was on your mind? When did the whole project, the vision, came on your mind first? How did it sprout, so to say?
First, let me thank you for having me in this podcast series. Victor de Breurs, I'm very happy that we start again this sort of transnational citizen connections, which was a little bit dying during the Corona years. So yes, we are talking Europe now and Europe sort of awakening and citizens feeling awakening. And let me begin like this. I definitely feel that we have a regression. You know, there were some years in the last decade between 2010 and the European elections of 2019, where we had broad discussions about creating civil society. We had new parties, European parties emerging like DM or like Volt in the Netherlands, pretty strong. I remember many travels to Utrecht and Nimwegen and Amsterdam, where I talked to the Volt people. So there was something called like a emerging European civil society. Yeah? And that, I guess, is what we are aiming to talk about, because that's the moment when we met, the two of us met. I remember many trips to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam in particular, when I wrote this book, Why Europe Should Become a Republic, a Political Utopia. That's the book you mentioned. It was Indeed. Kindly enough translated into Dutch by Atlas Publishing, Red Europa.
Yeah.
Dutch translation, Red Europa.
It's a bit more urgent, isn't it?
It's a little bit, yeah, it's a little bit more urgent anyway. So there were a couple of good discussions with Dutch people on this book. And so let's come back. What was the genesis of the book? And in one sentence, it's what I already described. I wanted to capture the moment of the creation of a European civil society after the banking crisis. For me, the two events are related. And to make a long story short, in the 1990s, where I had the chance, among other things, to work for Jacques Delors, the former president of the European Commission. So there were big ambitions for Europe. And I'm 58 years old now. I remember a decade between the Maastricht Treaty, Maastricht, Dutch town, the Maastricht Treaty and basically to 92 and say the European Constitution draft 2003. I remember a decade when Europe had big ambitions. And Jacques Delors always called these things les grands projets européens. So the euro-making, enlargement, and the constitution, to name the three. And so in the first decade of the century or the millennium, we succeeded in the enlargement, we succeeded in the euro, and we didn't succeed in the constitution. And there was something breaking in the political aim of the project, this sort of, we couldn't do the constitutional thing. We couldn't do, in a way, the state making, because there was a huge discussion in the years before 2001, 2003, before the constitution came on the market. For instance,
it's interesting that you call it a market. I will come to that
later. On the book market, say, in the public sphere. I want to quote two books because the French are always very strong in philosophy. Etienne Balibar, Sommes-nous citoyens de l'Europe? Are we European citizens? A great book of the year 2000, which basically rose the question, are we European citizens? Can we make a European constitution? The book is now 23 years old.
Well, I think that's a very interesting one because that's a book I also read a couple of years ago, many years ago already when it was published and shortly after at least. What I've always found very fascinating, quite fascinating, is that we discussed in the years, in the first two, I think, decennia of the 21st century, we discussed Europe broadly and intensely, but it was more, at least in the Netherlands, these discussions were always about more or less Europe, but not about what is Europe? What kind of Europe do we want to create? What kind of Europe do we want to live in? And this is something that I think missed. That was part of the reason, I believe, that many people felt disconnected or didn't feel any connection at all with Europe. We had in a practical sense.
Yeah, I agree. We had a, institutional discussion because we were having this Laken Declaration. We were in a constitutional process. We had the other big important book of Jean-Marc Ferry, La question de l'État européen, the question of a European state. I guess the point I want to make is that some 20 years ago, before the European Constitution then failed, we were further ahead with the discussion than today. So we had a big constitutional project that we discussed in length and in depth. I agree with you. It was, technical or constitutional or legal stuff, less about identity and stuff like this. But at least it was there, and it was a huge project that then failed. And it brings me to the Dutch no and the French no in 2005. Yeah. I remember quite well the liberal Netherlands, and then came Pim Fortuyn, and then came Theo van Gogh, who was shot. And this was this sort of dark moment in the Netherlands when a liberal homosexual regisseur, filmmaker was basically shot, and the liberal country I knew and I loved, the Netherlands. I travel a lot. I'm born in Western Germany, so I have many bicycle rides through the whole Netherlands, and you could really sense the turnaround, of this Dutch no, and then followed by the French no. We had two founding father countries who out of this turned anti-European in a sense, or anti-constitutional for reason. I think it's very important that we do an in-depth analysis, because there were reasons to go for a no, because this constitution obviously was neoliberal. It was obviously this, Bolkestein regulation about the workers, and we were in the enlargement moment, and there was the fear for all these migrant workers from the eastern side. So there were a very neoliberal component in the constitution. It was technical, I admit very easily all this. Yeah, but still, and I admit the changing.
But at least the project was there.
Yeah, and I admit the very important reasons for the Dutch population to say no, this turnaround in the liberal sort of society. And same for France, because in France it was the Le Plombier Polonais, the Polish plumber. Mm-hmm. But it was also Turkey accession that was negotiated in the same moment, because we signed the accession agreement with Turkey in October 2004, and the two referenda was in May, June 2005. Yeah, so there was this fear that we wouldn't do this, the integrated political union, and we would not be able to do this with Turkey. So there were many reasons that these referenda failed. But the point I want to make, to just jump to today, 20 years ago we had these constitutional making. It failed for the reasons we discussed. Europe slips into banking crisis. We are deeply sensing that there is a political momentum missing. Europe is under the impact of financial market for years. It was basically an American mortgage crisis, an American real estate crisis that comes to Europe. The US could fix it. 2 years later, the US are through the crisis. They put some bankers into prison and the US economy is running again. But Europe had no political clout to fix the banking crisis. Yeah? And there is a French economist working at the Peterson Institute in Washington who once said, it's politics stupid. Yeah. So we basically made a story about lazy Greeks and lazy Italians and this and that, and about interest rates, spreads, and so on and so forth. But the real story is that in the banking crisis between 2007 and 2012, until Mario Draghi finally would say whatever it takes, there were 4 years of political vacuum. We could not fix it because there was no sovereignty in the governance to do it. And what basically filled the vacuum by then was German, let's call it hegemony or dominance. Yeah, there is a huge talk about German dominance filling the system in the council, basically Schuldenbremse, all these sort of how Europe is moving out of banking crisis, follow the Germans. And so the European system shifts from a political ambition with balanced sort of bargaining to a German dominant system in the banking crisis, which is filling the gap of political decision-making. Yeah? And the point I want to come to, because you were asking me now, where do we find the European demos and why did I write the book? The point I wanted to make is that after this experience of banking crisis, of the political vacuum, of the German dominance filling this vacuum, there was the uprisal of the South. It was the youth of the South, the Italian, Greek, Portuguese, Spanish South, who basically did the demonstrations against ECB in Frankfurt, remember, in June 2016.
Yeah, I was there, absolutely. Yeah.
12, yeah. There was Stefan Essel, Empört euch, Indignez-vous. There was Varoufakis basically creating the hope for the southern, Europeans. We do not want austerity. And all this was there. And and then came Tsipras, and then came Podemos, and then came all this sort of civil society ambition from the southern youth of Europe, basically saying, this is not our Europe. This technocratic EU structure is not our Europe. That was the first sort of thing. But the second thing was, we are equal citizens of Europe. And we are not doing this crisis where we basically reframe a banking crisis as Euro crisis, where we blame the Greeks for an American mortgage crisis, because there was a huge reframing exercise. It was told, indeed, the story was told that the Greek are guilty, but it was the American mortgage system and the German Landesbanken, and so we divided Europe into a good north and a bad south, and the northern populism started with the True Finns and Geert Wilders and AfD and FPÖ on the northern side, and then there were the bad southern guys, this austerity, Tsipras, Podemos people, whatever. So we had a strong division, but, and that is the essential point, the good side of all this emerging sort of resentment against the technocratic structure of the EU was that for the first time, and that would be my argument, there was something as citizens feeling agents of European democracy. There was and what we experienced in the midst of the last decade, say 2012, 13, 14, is before we would always speak of European integration, and integration was a business of states because states do integrate. But in that moment of, say, emerging European civil society with the demonstrations and the European South speaking out, we basically had European citizens as agents of European unity. And so we shifted a paradigm. We shifted the agents from state to citizens, and we shifted the goal from integration to democracy. States do integration, citizens do democracy. And I think the turning point in the post-banking crisis years were precisely this paradigm shift from states that do integration to European citizens that do European democracy. And in this moment, I wrote my book. And I guess this is why it got such a perception and such a success, basically 80,000 tirage, plus e-books, plus 8 translations. But it was because in German you would say, ich habe in ein Wespennest gestochen. And I picked, like in this wespennest, that there was something fundamentally changing in the question, who's the sovereign of Europe? Who decides? And we were aiming at answering to that question, the citizens decide. And
but if you take it from that point, because I'm fascinated by what you say, and I think you're right that for the first time in history, at least the history in the last 20 or last 2 or 3 centuries, I think indeed the citizens rose above the nation state as the fundamental sort of political actors in the larger political environment, geopolitical environment. But if you take it from there, what do you think will happen in the say 50 or 40, 50 or 60 or 70 years ahead? Because the main social challenges that we face, climate change, geopolitical tensions, shifting dynamics, shifting balances, to put it in that way, migration. I mean, these are all topics that can't be dealt with by the nation state separately, not even by a certain level of cooperation. We saw that, it failed. So here we are as Europeans, calling ourselves whatever we call ourselves, Spaniards, Basques, people from Berlin or Amsterdam, or Europeans. Don't you think this amid all the troubles that we face and all the resentment that there is, don't you think there is a good chance that we rise in consciousness, so to say, that we can only deal with these challenges together, and that we have a common interest, so to say, and that perhaps that is what makes us Europeans? At least to start with.
I agree. Let's do a little bit of, say, political science to come to your, migration, climate, and all of this. So this discourse, all nations are too small to act, is old. We say this since decades, And probably in the Netherlands, you realize this a little bit earlier than in big fat Germany, so this... But still, I think the nation state. Well, what can it do in an increasingly multipolar world? Where the balancing and the bargaining is no longer among European states, but it's also between Europe and India and Russia and Southern Africa, whatever. BRICS, emerging BRICS countries, and all these things. And we realize in Europe that we don't have many resources. We are not Siberia. We don't have gold like gold mines in South Africa. We don't have the rainforest. You know what I mean? Europe is realizing that we have good universities, probably a lot of intelligence and cognitive capabilities, value, but we are not leading in technology. China, we are not rich in resources. So there's a real question about what can Europe bring to the world? What do we need? What do we want to bargain, and what we can bring to the world? So there is a question of European identity there. But I want to make one remark before. If you say this sort of long sentence, we're realizing all nation state is too small to act, which is the classical European discourse, that's why we need to integrate, blah, 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 The real question is, what is the nation state? And I want to say that we have tendency, at least in political discussions, that the nation state is linked to identity, language, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is the more obvious sort of, my nation state is the Dutch feeling, the German feeling, the French, I think there are some interesting points to make that may help us to unite on a European level. There's a French discussion about the books of Marcel Mauss. Marcel Mauss is a French sociologue who wrote a very, very interesting book in 1923, and the book is Die Nation oder der Sinn für Soziale, the nation or the sense for the social. And the definition that Marcel Mauss offers, what a nation is to say those who live in institutionalized solidarity. So in a system where the question of solidarity does not arise in a moment of crisis. So now let's take a look at the Greek crisis and the Euro crisis, or the banking crisis, We discussed in length whether we help the Greeks or not, or whether the Greeks are lazy or should be helped or perhaps thrown out of the euro, The point I want to make we were not in a system of institutionalized solidarity. Because if we had institutionalized solidarity, if we had the understanding that we are citizens on an equal level, where the system of whether we help or not does not arise, all this had not happened. So here's my point. If in the future we want to understand us as European citizens as a demos in a political entity called Europe, because we were able or are able to provide an identity, an underpinning of why we are together in this as European citizens, the one and single element we should strive for is, auf Deutsch, der Grundsatz der allgemeinen politischen Gleichheit. So the principle of political equality, of legal political equality. You are citizens, or the notion of citizen requires that those citizens who call themselves citizens, meaning European citizens in this respect, need to have a legal equality. Yeah. So now, here's a central point. We share a lot of rights, you as a Dutch and me as a German, a lot of rights. We are consumers of the same market. We are market citizens. We have free movement of person. We share a lot of rights that the EU has provided us. But what we do not yet share is what the French sociologue Pierre Rosanvallon actually calls le sacre du citoyen, the holiness of citizenship, which is voting, access to the social and political rights, like demonstrations.
Yeah.
In these three categories, we are still at the end national citizens and not European citizens.
But when I come to your point of solidarity, and if you take the nation state as a to put it in my words or other words at least, as a institutionalized solidarity, basically, then I mean from a certain point of view, you can doubt whether the nation state is unraveling. At least, for example, in the Netherlands, I mean, many people are seriously questioning here farmers' rights to be compensated, or farmers' right to at least be helped in the nitrogen crisis that we have here. I don't know if you heard of that, but
absolutely, yeah, I heard all about it.
And this is just one example. You see, so many, and in Groningen, where we have this discussion, basically we used Groningen and the gas fields that we have there for decades to compensate for all sorts of finances here in the Netherlands, in the rest of the Netherlands. But now Groningen is literally sinking. There is serious debate on whether we should help them or not, and I do think we need to help them. But they feel so left alone that there's already a discussion: are we still a part of the Netherlands, truly, of the Solidarity Union?
Yeah. I agree, and I totally agree, and I totally see the point. And I think we need to distinguish, say, a more theoretical discussion from a more sort of policy-like discussion, yeah? Mm-hmm. Because what you're describing with the Dutch farmers, and I follow this a lot, and this basically destabilization of the whole agricultural system, with this nitrat question, and basically Enteignung, so depossession, in a way, and then this strong party that has been formed, Peasants' Party. But I think on a structural level, there is an emerging discussion which is very visible now, which is a lawmaking where we see the refeudalization on a global scale. The refeudalization process is on a global scale. And what happens to the Dutch farmers is, I think, one process of this refeudalization structural process, that is ongoing in the Netherlands, in France, which is the erosion of the republic through capitalism, if you want. Antoine Vaucher has the Code of Capital. Karin Pistor has written a very good book on this, Karin Pistor in Columbia University, about basically that the lawmaking is hijacked by the meritocratic elites, and they are shifting the system into refeudalized structures. And she does this analysis for the US, and Antoine Vaucher, French political scientist, does the same. The neoliberalization of the French Republic is his book, and he does the same analysis for France. And I guess what happens to the peasants in the Netherlands, you could write the same book for the Netherlands, right? Mm-hmm. So that is a process which is ongoing, which I think we should put it aside. It's a political reality, I share, But my point, answering to your question, how can we create a European demos that would be ready and democratic and able to decide as a unity on big political projects like climate, like migration, on a European level. The only point I'm making, if you want more on a theoretical level, is if we really keep to the ambition, or call it utopia, to create a European demos and to want a political system that unites us as European citizens, we need to have one single thing, which is equality, legal equality of European citizens in all matters. You cannot have a democracy with unequal citizens. So we would, I do a conjunctive here, yeah? But we would need seriously to discuss questions that we had already been discussing a decade ago, like a European unemployment scheme, like a European poverty scheme, like, just to make that point clear, I'm not comparing the Netherlands to Bulgaria. Yeah, we need to look on those countries who are already in the euro. And I'm not arguing that everybody would need to have the same salary or whatever. Yeah, but structurally, and this is not the case in Germany. You don't have the same salary or the same whatever.
No,
yeah?
exactly.
But what you have in Germany as a state is that you have the same access to rights. So if I'm unemployed, wherever I am in the Federal Republic, I have the same rights to get assurance de chômage, so unemployment aid. Yeah. So, and that is the reasoning. And I put this evening up front of our conversation because if we want to break out of the system where in a European Council we have 27 countries and there's always one country who does not want X and Y. The Polish do not want to leave carbon and the French do not want to leave nuclear energy and Germany wants windmills all over the place, whatever. And then you have a national veto, blah, blah, blah. If we want to move out of this scheme of decision making, which we are hanging around since 70 years, and we want to have the citizens as actors for building a European democracy and transcending European integration, we would need to discuss the very principle of a democracy, which is equality for European citizens.
But this is something that I'm quite interested in. So, do we have a chicken and egg problem? A chicken or egg? Who was first? What needs to be there first? Yeah. Because if we have this discussion on a political or at least on a theoretical level, and maybe perhaps on a political level in Brussels, about creating the same level of basic citizens' rights, you see, for all Europeans. I mean, I believe that what is necessary to create at least the political will to do so is a feeling of solidarity with one another.
I agree. But
so it's a spiral. So where to start? How do we create
where to start? I tell you, let's go back to Jacques Delors, but for a second. There is a deep ambiguity when on most papers of the European Union, if you go to the website of the EU, you have the European citizens. There is a text, whatever text is, the European citizens, the European citizens. My point is, there is no such thing than a European citizens in the proper meaning of the word. We are, at the end of the day, you are a Dutch citizen, I'm a German citizen, my friend is a French, my sons are French citizens.
Well, unfortunately, I still am a Dutch citizen. I mean, I'm glad to live here, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather be a European citizen, actually.
But that's precisely my point. Remember the European elections 2019. There was an Austrian pop band, Bilderbuch. Mm-hmm. And they had a video in front of the European elections basically claiming for a European passport. But I think what we need to understand is for now we have this rote Hülle. So we have a passport where is, the Netherlands and then passport of the European Union. So we are basically having a sort of Hülle. How do you say Hülle?
I know what you mean. The Brits had that too until Brexit.
But it's not yet real. And and now I hear the critiques who come. Oh, Madame Guéraud wants to supranationalize and centralize Europe. No, I do not. Because basically legal equality does not mean centralization first, but legal equality of citizens does not mean losing identity neither. And the argument for this is understanding that, for instance, the Bretons, les Bretons en France, and les Corses, les Corsica people, they do not share identity. They don't even share the same language. But both of them are citizens of the French Republic because the French Republic guarantees them equal right, for instance, assurance de chômage when they are unemployed. And the system for Europe, in my opinion, and that's why I'm very intrigued when you tell me that you have doing a podcast on cities, and my ambition for Europe would be that we could work on this equal citizenship in all belongings, independently of where we come from, independently of origin, independently of identity, and that would basically pave the way for European democracy. Because if we want democracy, we need equal citizenship. And if we don't have this, we will be stuck with the council voting system. And the council voting system will push us into national chauvinism and national regression, because then there will always be some countries like the Dutch or the Danes or the Germans who are always better than the others or better than the lazy Greeks. Yeah. So the question now is, can we work on this discourse? Can we get an understanding within Europe that we have a cultural underpinment, a cultural sort of resonance that makes us Europeans, which would allow us to argue and to strive for this solidarity out of which we claim equal rights? For me, this is the central question. I mean, can we understand that I, as a German, have the same rights than a Greek citizen?
And I think that's something that you mentioned. That, I mean, despite the one, or perhaps one of the good things of the resentment after the Greek crisis or the Euro crisis in general in Southern Europe, was that the youth was stepping up to the plate and saying, well, this is not our Europe. We want a different Europe. And the Europe that we want is a Europe in which we are all equal, at least by law, and in our citizens' rights as citizens of Europe. So don't you think there is a process? Perhaps it is going very slowly and too slow, perhaps, in our view. But don't you think a process has started in which we, perhaps partly unconsciously, are developing towards a consciousness, a level of consciousness of Europe, being citizens of Europe, being Europeans?
Yeah. I would say a clear yes, and I give you two examples. Because the North-South divide is only one of the divisions. The other division is East-West. And the Eastern countries are also looking at themselves as second-class Europeans. And why that? Yeah. Because we didn't allow them to come into the euro. I traveled a lot in Poland, in Hungary, Budapest and Prague. And what you hear is that because of our banking crisis, Poland didn't come in the euro in 2011 and Hungary did not come into the euro in 2008. But the treaties say that all countries should aim to come to the euro as quickly as possible. And the zloty, for instance, is fixed in exchange rates 1-4. 1 euro, 4 zlotys. Yeah. So Poland could come to the euro, but they are beyond the discussion, and so they are feeling declassified. They are feeling sort of second-class Europeans. I was in Prague and I discussed this with the mayor of Europe, of Prague, and precisely on the book of the European Republic. And I argued precisely this, equal rights. And then the mayor of Prague told me, Madame Guéraud, this is fantastic. We in the East, we would love this to see. And I will translate your book into the Czech, what he did, but you will have problems to argue this in your western part of Europe. And I say, I know, but I will argue it anyway, because that's the only way that brings us to European democracy. So now, I think we have this discussion sort of silently and hiddenly, because I guess you looked up this conference on the future of Europe that the EU organized, 1 year, all this moderation and the citizen panels. If you go through the 49 conclusions, most of them, if you read them carefully, are striving for equality. When it comes to health systems, why, through the corona crisis, who has a good treatment and who didn't have a good treatment, and so on and so forth, So this conference on the future of Europe didn't invite any expert, It was not sort of academic people. It was just random selected people. But you could see in the Citizens' Assembly, for instance, a 60-year-old Slovenian woman who would just say this: I want to be equal in rights with the other citizens, European Citizens Fellows. So there is an intuition. I found this very striking, and I did some research on this, but I found this very striking that intuitively the European citizens have this sort of in their being, that if we want to be in a political project together, we need to be equal. And the very interesting thing is that the moment that the 49 conclusions were presented in May 22 last year, the council wiped them off the agenda im Tagesordnungspunkt Verschiedenes. Look at the council meeting. So the council basically gave a signal: what do I have to respect the opinions of the citizens? So we have a clear competition line between the European Council.
Well, I think that'll cost them dearly. I think history will be hard on them. Because I believe this process is going on. As you say, it's already going on in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, but I think even here in the Netherlands is going on because. One example, a short story. When I was still working for the Dutch Minister of Finance, and this was in the midst of the euro crisis. At a certain point, I was in Spain and I was in Greece, to oversee all sorts of processes there, and with these financial aid packages that we partly provided as the Netherlands. Problem was that back then, the public opinion here in the Netherlands was overwhelmingly, let them sell their airports and their harbors and their infrastructures, and privatize it all. And then you see they got some money to pay us back or whatever. Very much the market rhetoric that we saw in the 80s and the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century. Now, a few years later, people start to see, people who just read the newspaper, they start to see here that the Chinese were the ones who bought the airports. And exactly. Yeah. So now we said, oh, bugger, we made a big mistake there. So people come to see that the whole market ideology is slowly fading.
I agree.
Is very narrow. It's much too narrow to run a society on. So, and even a continent on, a European project on. And so now we have a new sort of wave here, slowly coming up, of people saying, we need to cooperate at least. And for cooperation, we need to be equal, because we're all Europeans. And in the end, people are, if we don't treat the Italians or the Greeks respectfully, they'll buy themselves out with the Chinese or the Russians even.
I couldn't agree more. This is a very, very central point. It's so important that the moment the American hegemony on the world is fading and we are entering a multipolar world with Chinese and BRICS and Russia and so on and so forth. There's this whole complex of the Ukraine war, but we understand that we need to be together in, together out if we want to have a European role in the world, if we want to succeed in the issues of climate migration, technology, and all these things, and that if we want to succeed in these things, in the policy areas, we need to build a polity that allows us a democratic bargaining, because the council mechanism will no longer be sufficient. To make it very short, we could frame it in the way that we need to overcome citizen nationalism. Right? Citizen nationalism, One have more rights than others, Which is a classical sort of claim for equality. And in the history of the European Union, what we did in the 80s, remember the single market, was nothing more than to fight nationalism of goods. Most people are too young today, but in these times we would fight for the Reinheitsgebot des deutschen Biers, and the Italians would not like to have pasta produced with eggs, and the Greeks had the feta, and the French the champagne, and every country had a thing and would say, we have this, it's better than the other products. It's ours, and no other beer than German beer in the German supermarket. And then came the European Court and said, look, any product legally produced in the territory of the European Union must be sold in any supermarket of the European Union. That was basically equality for goods. And then in the 90s, a decade later, we said, okay, now we have a common market, but it's very silly to have a common market in which we compare the price of, say, carrots in Escudo, Gulden, Franken, whatever. We have a common market, but a common market without a common currency is senseless. So we created the wording of one market, one currency. Because the currency, the euro, at the end of the day is nothing else than legal equality for money. So we went from legal equality from goods to legal equality for money. And I think 20 years later, because the euro was basically done in 1999, 2002, we are 20 years later, we should do legal equality for citizens. One market, one currency, one democracy. And I think this is the project for the next years. And then, and only then, we would be paving the way for a democratic system that we move the system out of the technocracy that we all complain about, this trilogy between a council and commission and parliament, and nobody knows who does what, and there's no
ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, yeah. And so we are beyond.
It was
this.
set up in the 20th century, but it's more something from the 19th century.
We created it because we had reason to create it this way. We created it with the sui generis, all these books on the European Union are talking about the sui generis. So we invented the system, but the system is flawed, and we should have the intelligence to move the European polity system to full-fledged democracy.
I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Iam europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia.
Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Ja sam evropljanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem Europejczykiem.
Esu europiete.
Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja grażanka Европы.
Я громадянка Європи.
Esu europiete.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.